my honor. Actually, when Anna was just giving the introductions and she mentioned all those titles, it reminds me of the Soviet Union, where you measure the influence or authority by the number of telephones that were on the desk, as opposed to salaries or money. And the same thing in academia. They give you a bunch of titles, but they don't give you any money or any other kind of material benefits. But let me thank you for inviting me to speak to you. And I have to say, when I looked at the program, this is really a real honor, not only for me, but obviously for you as well. I mean, notwithstanding the politics of the day and the craziness in U.S.-Russian relations, arguably this is the best time to be doing this kind of program. And I have a colleague that's coming here, I guess, in a couple of weeks, that's going to be presenting you a very different way of thinking about things, or doing research using big data analytics. Because ironically, notwithstanding the politics of the day, when I was studying the Soviet Union and Russia, we had so little information, and we had to be very creative with it. Now there's too much information, and now people are questioning what information is. So it's a very dynamic time. And but before I start substantively, I also want to begin, and I hate doing this, but begin with an apology, because I'm going to give the presentation today and tomorrow in English. Because one of the casualties of this rocky road in U.S.-Russian relations over the last 25 years is that I was trained as a political scientist and a Russian area person, all ready to merge those two, and I finally got the job, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and so did the interest in teaching Russia and Eurasian areas studies. So I spent a lot of time retooling and doing other things, including looking at energy issues. And so I've let my Russian language skills atrophy a bit, but I promise that I'll make it up to you in other ways. But and I gather you have two other presenters today who are going to give you your fill. So what a time to be thinking about Russian energy. And obviously there's been much ado about it. Really, for the last 15 years or so, this has really been seen as at the epicenter of Russia's foreign policy. And most recently, when the focus has been on Russia's assertiveness, especially as viewed from the West, energy has really been implicated in that. So there's been much ado about energy and Russia's gas weapon in particular. And what I want to do today is really kind of take a step back and look at the broader context within which energy and international relations and Russian foreign policy intersect. I want to talk a little bit, and I'll mention in a couple minutes, about what we think we know about the relationship between energy and diplomacy and international relations, and where Russia fits in that crosshairs. But like I said, this is a topic that is rife for debate. And it's really been at the crux of three different debates. On the one hand, there's been a specific focus on the energy issue, and some people see that Russia, for example, has used energy, if you will, as an instrument to bludgeon adversaries and former satellites, where Russia uses energy and pipelines in particular, and the threats and actual cutoffs to work its will, not only commercially, but in a non-commercial sense. And so since really 2013, the end of 2013, the crisis with Ukraine was seen really as the third act in a long-running play of geopolitical gamesmanship using energy at the fulcrum. Others take a very different view of that, looking at energy. They too see energy as an instrument of statecraft, but see that the tables have been turned fundamentally on Russia, especially over the last 10 years or so with the changing natural gas landscape, where we've seen a shift, as I'm going to talk about, in terms of the abundance of supply, where supply is coming from, and sort of the changing political geography of supply and demand, that yes, energy is an instrument of statecraft, but Russia actually has a weak hand in that. And really what we've been seeing since 2013 is Russian weakness as opposed to Russian strength on the energy side. So there's a debate with respect to where energy fits, specifically in how to read Russian energy statecraft. And some, as this sort of split pane suggests, either Russia is that sort of bear on the pipeline, or it's the EU through its soft power and regulations that has been able to really tame that bear. There's been another level of debate where energy has really been implicated in a much broader sense of Russian foreign policy and sort of Putin's strategy of hybrid warfare or next generation warfare, where energy is one of those soft power instruments that is leveraged across domains to have political and non-commercial influence. So it's very much a part of a broader strategy, foreign policy strategy, that Russia is practicing, to act really as a 21st century power, right? If you read the newspapers today, especially coming out of the West, right, Russia seems to be 20 feet tall, right? Very deft and working and punching above its weight, using soft power, using different areas of strength to offset its weaknesses, right? To play the jiu-jitsu game, right? Putin's the judo master and exploits weaknesses. And energy is one of those areas that Russia is seen to deftly use to work its will. Alternatively, others look at Russian energy statecraft since the Soviet collapse as a reflection not of a 21st century state that's practicing hybrid diplomacy or warfare, but really a 19th century atavistic imperial power that's simply using energy to exert its neo-imperial influence, right? So there's a debate over the broader contours of Russian grand strategy, where energy is really implicated in these two different versions of Russia, being a 21st century state or 19th century state. And of course, energy also animates a much broader debate over how to understand what are the drivers of foreign policy. And in particular, there are real questions, right, about what is a gas war? I mean, is a gas war defined by, cutoffs or plays for control over territory? Or is the actual cutoff of pipeline a reflection of weakness? Right? Because if, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, if you're threatening to do something or else, right, you want to coerce an adversary to do something by issuing threats, if you have to follow through on that threat, that may actually be a failure of that threatening coercive strategy. You actually have to use brute force. So what is a gas war? What is a gas weapon? Also, energy has been a focal point of the rise of resource nationalism that sees energy as one more instrument where states use natural resources in a zero-sum kind of conflictual set of relationships, as opposed to another school of thought that sees energy really as a reflection of interdependence, right? It's the market stupid. It's markets, firms, right? Comparative advantage, mutual interest, and interdependence, right, to solve problems like energy or environmental security that not one state can solve by itself, right? So energy really is a reflection of that interdependence school. And then, of course, there are a range of sociological explanations, and those of you who study international relations or political science know that there are arguments rooted in interest groups and the role of different non-state actors or different types of domestic political institutions, or the ways that countries conceive of their energy security are very different. Like Russia, right, they're concerned about selling natural gas and oil. So they are worried about, right, demand security. Other countries, right, are buying this and they're worried about supply security, right? And so the way that they construct their energy security is very different. It's not a universal way of doing things. Also, even countries that have the same profile of endowments, right, may conceive of their energy security very different. Some rely on the international market to trade, others want to protect the scarce resources that they have. right? So there are different explanations, the sort of the constructivist vein. And then there are concerns about reputations, right? Russia has sold natural gas, for example, to Europe for several decades now, has established relations with different companies in different countries, and they have a reputation to protect. And so that is, some argue that that's really what's driving what's going on. And ultimately, some claim that energy is just a reflection of politics, right? And so countries, for various political reasons, either domestic politically or geopolitically, they securitize pipelines. They make them a security issue that's a reflection, if you will, of whatever political gamesmanship is at stake. So let me just give you my bottom line. I think I gave you several pieces to read, and I don't like giving my own reading, but I gave you one just to sort of cut to the chase. But in case you haven't gotten to it, I mean, my bottom line is when we look at what's gone on since the end of, really, I would argue since 2009, but certainly became very conspicuous since the Ukraine crisis erupted, is that when we look at energy, and specifically the natural gas dimension to that crisis that continues, we've seen tremendous restraint on all sides. Okay, and I'll unpack some of that. But unlike in 2006 and 2009, when there were mere conflicts over price and over supply, those tensions precipitously escalated into cutoffs. And here we've seen the dismemberment of one of the players, Ukraine, and yet gas is, for the most part, continued to flow, certainly to Europe and even to Ukraine during critical periods of this crisis. So that's a puzzle. But unlike there are some recent books out on Russian foreign policy and U.S.-Russian relations that talk about, why is it that we're at this low ebb of the relationship? Well, it's because neither side takes into account the other side, and we're in this downward spiral. And I would argue when we look at the energy dimension, there's not only been restraint, and the restraint has been costly. So there have been mutual compromises that all of the players have made. But unlike that broader picture of the foreign policy relationship, this terrain has been moving. And I would argue that since even 2013, the relations actually on the energy front, especially on the natural gas front, have become increasingly pragmatic. So the question is, why is that the case? And that's going to be what we're going to talk a lot about tomorrow. But just to foreshadow, I see that that's a function of the much broader changing natural gas landscape, not only in terms of new supply, but the way that gas is delivered and how that's empowered different relationships and created new dimensions of power, influence, and leverage. In essence, we are moving away from thinking about pipeline politics, point-to-point power relations, right, between supplier and customer, where a supplier can threaten to cut off or customer can threaten to go to another supplier. But now we're seeing a set of network relationships where power and influence are practiced in a very different way. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And at different levels, between states, between companies, and within the infrastructure itself. And this, I would argue, has fundamentally different strategic implications. This suggests that Russia may be down. It's no longer in the driver's seat like it was to work its will in a non-commercial way with natural gas, like it was really leading up to 2009. But Russia is far from being out. They are a critical player, but the game is becoming, as I mentioned, more pragmatic in a commercial sense. In other words, commercial logic is dominating, so you're going to see competition and sometimes flare-ups, but it'll be mostly on a commercial plane, I would argue, largely due to the changing landscape of natural gas and how it's manifested itself in this network set of relationships. And so therefore, I would argue finally that we need to rethink our policies in responding to, let's say, Russia on the energy front. And so tomorrow we'll have a little exercise and we'll talk more specifically about sanctions, which seem to be the policy du jour. But I would argue, and I will argue tomorrow, that this network set of relationships may suggest the limitations and highlight some of the dimensions of Russia's foreign policy that are not otherwise reflected, as well as some of the limitations of that policy response, and that we need to think out of the box a little bit more about how we practice statecraft. So those are the sort of the bottom lines that I hope you take from the next 2 days. But what I want to do is twofold, really, between today and tomorrow. And I have to apologize again, as I'm probably going to do a lot more talking today, because I want to help set the stage in terms of making sure we understand the context within which energy becomes an instrument of statecraft in general, and where Russia fits into that, and some of the ebbs and flows in Russian policy in the energy space. And then tomorrow I'll give you this alternative way of thinking about things rooted in network analysis, and also show you a little bit what we're doing in terms of making some of this network analysis interactive, so that for policymakers who want to think about these networks come alive and think about what happens if they try to influence these networks, what are the second and third order effects. And so I'll demonstrate a little bit of that. Okay, so what I want to do basically today is, like I said, take a step back and say, what do we think we know about energy statecraft? What do we think we know? What actually do we know? What does the research tell us about this? Because, you know, it's one of these areas where there's a lot of conventional wisdom, and I would argue myths about the oil weapon or the gas weapon. And then I want to talk specifically about some of the puzzles of pipeline politics that we need to pay attention to, that suggests that we need to think about these as elements of strategic interaction between parties, not just looking at one country's foreign policy and where energy fits in that foreign policy, but to really understand energy conflict and the value of a gas weapon. We need to understand it in the context of the motivations of the parties, right? The conditions, the environmental conditions that shape the ability to act, and the information that's available. So it's motivations or preferences, choices, conditions that shape behavior. And then tomorrow what I'll do, then what we'll do today is, after we take that sort of deep dive into understanding the broader contours, then we'll look more specifically at Russia and what's gone on really since the Soviet collapse, and the different dimensions and puzzles to Russian energy diplomacy. And then what I'll do is we'll end a little bit on how the energy landscape is changing, especially in the natural gas domain. So this will constitute sort of your background for then tomorrow, when we look specifically at the Ukraine crisis and some of the peculiarities of that crisis, and you know, sort of superimpose a network perspective on things. Okay? And like Anna mentioned, I'll be happy to meet with you guys for dinner or otherwise tomorrow to fill in some of the gaps. But I think I gave you some of the readings that cover different parts of this. And what I want you to do today is, after our discussion here, maybe reflect on some of these on your notes, and maybe go back and look at the readings, because tomorrow what I want to do, and take the last part of the session, is to break up into groups, and for you guys to think about the utility of sanctions, and should we further sanction Russia, especially in the energy domain, and what are the strengths and weaknesses and costs and effectiveness of those kinds of things. So I want you to kind of pull everything together. So if you haven't had an opportunity to read the material, I'd suggest you do that tonight, because I've given you a couple pieces that talk specifically about sanctions that will come bring to bear. All right? All right, also, I've given no PDFs of these slides and the slides I'll show you tomorrow. So, you know, you'll have those for your own edification. And you'll see I have a lot of slides. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of them, but at least you'll have some. All right, so what do we know or think we know about energy statecraft? Well, let me just say that this is obviously a topic of high political and scholarly relevance, and for the most part there's a conventional wisdom that suggests that really energy is a potent instrument of statecraft, and it's really rooted in more realist or relative power types of understandings, where it really is a source of conflict. Energy, either there's rivalry over unclaimed resources, or attempts by one side to exploit vulnerabilities of the other via pipelines or supply relations or customer relationships. And so energy has been implicated as a source of conflict motivating both suppliers and customers, right? The suppliers that seem to be, those that have advantages seek to exploit the vulnerabilities of downstream customers. But the weak are also seen to be prone to conflict because they have high sensitivity to their vulnerability, and so seek to sometimes precipitate a conflict in the present to avoid more unfavorable terms in the future. So energy is seen as a driver of conflict for both the suppliers, or the strong, and the weak, traditionally customers, but also others. Energy is seen because of its infrastructure, right, pipelines, as, pipelines are really basically seen as steel umbilical cords of dependency, right, that lock in relationships that can then therefore be exploited by the strong over the weak. Others have even said that, I don't know how, and if any of you have studied nuclear strategy, but there was mutual assured destruction, and the notion that the deterrence existed because the costs of going to war were so high that no side could rationally ever make that decision to go to war. So there was this sort of mutual, as long as both sides could destroy the other, it was sort of don't move or I'll shoot, right? And so this was the source of stability between the United States and the Soviet Union, arguably during the Cold War, rooted in nuclear deterrence. Well, obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed and the nuclear situation, while still there, the incentives are very different. Some have argued that energy now has stepped in to fill that void because of the mutual dependency between Russia and Europe, right? Both sides are sort of intoxicated with the supply and dependency relationships, such that any disruption of that relationship would be suicidal for both of them, mutually suicidal. Right? So energy is sort of seen as this buttress for a mutual assured destruction relationship. And it's largely because energy is seen to be indispensable, right? Oil in particular, indispensable for military might and economic welfare. Right? It's one of those rare commodities that maintains that value. That's why the stakes are seen to be so high. And therefore, to the extent that countries can extract themselves from a mutually dependent relationship, they may have actually more influence and leverage to exert, right? This is the whole discussion around energy independence, right? The United States, right, with new production of natural gas and of oil, right? There's this notion that the United States is no longer dependent on the global trading system, and therefore we're no longer dependent on oil coming out of the Middle East. And as a result, we can unshackle ourselves from all of the perverse and pathological relationships that have developed around that oil dependency from the Middle East that give us much more freedom of action, so we can back Saudi Arabia, sometimes back Qatar, another time back, play off different actors and give us much more freedom, or pivot from the Middle East to East Asia, for example, where our interests may be more fundamental. Some argue. So energy has been actually implicated in the U.S. pivot, as well as we'll talk about in the Russian pivot to Asia, where it's because we're no longer dependent that we on that perceived to be dependent on the imports from the Middle East, or even that our allies aren't, that we have more freedom and flexibility in our statecraft. But again, rooted in sort of power politics, zero-sum logic. And of course, this has then therefore informed a range of different types of policies that have come out, right? Where we think about the gas weapon, or Russia as an energy superpower in this context. And if you ever go to Baku, and it was Baku in the 90s, but you still can see it today because they're interested in building a pipeline. Gas pipeline, there used to be a bumper sticker that said, "Happiness is multiple pipelines," right? And the notion was, sort of the Churchillian, diversity, diversity, diversity. That's where stability comes from, right? And so there are a whole host of policies aimed at building as many pipelines as possible coming out of Eurasia, not just Russia, or maybe some bypassing Russia. And so arguably during the Clinton administration and early Bush administration, there was a big emphasis on promoting alternative pipelines, bypass pipelines, etc. Some have even talked about an energy NATO, and that because of this mutual dependency, and certainly prior to 2008, there was a sense that there was dependency, there was a mutual interdependence between Russia and Europe, but there was asymmetrical. In other words, Russia was able to, threaten to cut off supplies, and therefore NATO needed to step in. And NATO, always in search of a new mission since the collapse of the Soviet Union, was gravitating towards this. And actually Senator Lugar, former Senator Lugar, was a champion of an energy NATO. And now another policy instrument that's emerged with the U.S. Increased production at home and becoming an exporter of natural gas and oil is that the U.S. can use its exports to come to the rescue, if you will, of this dependent Europe. So this sort of popular wisdom of energy being a source of conflict, either motivating suppliers or customers, strong or weak, all right, has manifested itself in a number of different policies. But when you look at the literature, and since you guys are students, I mean, this is a field that is ripe for study because it's been dominated by this wisdom, right? If you ask any politician, any policymaker, they're going to fall somewhere here, right? This is just seen, like oil is weapon. The reason we're in the Middle East is because of oil, right? The reason we now have an opportunity is because we're no longer dependent on oil, right? The oil is a source of conflict, or now increasingly natural gas, etc. But prior to 2008 or so, and I think the Brenda Schaefer piece that I assigned to you showed that there were less than a dozen articles written on this topic by scholars, because it was taken almost as for granted that this conventional wisdom of energy dependency. But those few articles, and really since 2008 or 10, there's been a sort of flurry of more analysis of these issues. It's become much more obvious that there are more myths than reality to that story. Energy, to the extent is implicated in conflict, is really one of several factors, and it tends to exacerbate a conflict that is pre-existing for other reasons. Energy conflicts in general are very rare, right? Actual going to war over resources or territory, very rare. Rare to see cutoffs in pipelines. Okay, so notwithstanding this conventional wisdom, the actual episodes and empirical evidence is very paltry, and it's very mixed, right? And so it remains a puzzle. This notion of energy independence really is a chimera. It's not. What does that mean, energy independence? Even if you're not buying oil, right, from abroad, the prices of oil at home are affected by that global market for oil. So you're being affected by the international arena whether or not you're directly involved in trading. Also, we trade, right, for a number of different reasons. Also, not just whether or not we're dependent on imports, but our allies are dependent. So you can't just sort of look at just our flows to get an understanding of to what extent we're engaged in the global arena and how independent we are. There's been no, as I mentioned, uniform effect of conflict. Sometimes pipelines are used to actually promote peace between warring parties. Other times, as I mentioned, pipeline politics exacerbate a pre-existing situation. But there's some things that some of the research demonstrates, and one is that there's been more conflict over oil than natural gas, although that's changing really since over the last decade and a half. There's been more threats as well as belligerent activity around natural gas, but historically oil has been where the action is. There's been more conflict over unproven as opposed to proven reserves, more conflict over resources that are on land as opposed to offshore. Right? There have been very few injuries, casualties in energy-related conflicts, unlike military conflict. Okay, so there's a very small, if you want to measure the intensity of conflict by the number of deaths, right? Energy rarely rises to the occasion. Conflicts can take place not only in terms of physical occupation or control over territory, but also involve not only cutoffs but threats. Right, so there's a lot more to energy diplomacy than looking at actual war. There are a whole host of coercive activities. Subsidies are also used as an instrument. So it's not just sort of the hard edge of energy diplomacy that you need to focus on. Sometimes it's giving favorable, preferential terms to an adversary to get them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. That is an instrument. Okay, there tends the action around energy diplomacy has less to do with counting the amount of resources that are in the ground for a country, either on the supply side or on the customer side, have more to do with the above ground factors, be it where the infrastructure is, okay, or the political economy around the trading relationships, or how countries conceive of their energy security, as opposed to the actual endowments. Another thing to keep in mind is that one of the more instrumental studies on the oil weapon shows that countries like Saudi Arabia, right, these petrostates, have a mixed record of being aggressive. Right? You'd think that, one argument is that they have a resource that others want, right? There's a supplier advantage, that they would be exploiting that. Or that they sell their oil and they buy arms and therefore would be more belligerent. Right? So, but actually we see that just looking at the oil, the petrostate nature, is not enough to explain the level of belligerence. You have to add another above ground factor, which is the type of regime it is. And one scholar says it's the revolutionary nature of the regime plus its oil endowments affect its belligerence. So again, it's above ground factors, not just looking at energy endowments. As I mentioned, natural gas has now become increasingly a focal point of energy diplomacy and statecraft as opposed to oil. And so we're kind of in uncharted territory because natural gas is emerging as a prominent commodity that's traded, and the way that it's traded is fundamentally shifting. So we don't have a lot of a good understanding of that. And also that energy conflicts tend to, as I mentioned before, be a strategic affair. They depend on the interaction, the choices that different parties make. And by the way, it's not just supplier and customer, but there are also transit states. There are states that are in the middle of pipelines who allow egress of flows and pipeline infrastructure that matter. So we can't just look at customers versus suppliers. And that for the most part we see that when we do have an energy conflict, a cutoff, or actually a war, that they tend to be a reflection of failed policies and inadvertent escalation that are mutually costly. Energy conflict, and those of you who have studied international relations and conflict in general, know that war is always a suboptimal outcome. Everybody would be better off, right, if they didn't fight, right? They may be able to achieve their ends without spilling as much blood and treasure. Okay, and energy is the same thing. Energy conflicts are suboptimal outcomes. That doesn't mean that there aren't there are countries that may threaten to go to war, but sometimes that gets out of control and it inadvertently escalates into this more suboptimal outcome. And I would argue that that's what the case has been for energy. And as a result, the whole notion of success gets muddled because, as I mentioned, the most of the evidence of energy being implicated in diplomacy has less to do with seizing territory and fighting bloody wars It's by issuing threats and practicing what's called statecraft, where energy is an instrument to try to manipulate other states to do either something that they don't want to do, to get them to take an action that you want them to take but they don't want to take, or to get them not to take an action that they may want to take but you don't want them to take, right? Deterrence or coercion. And in that case, when we actually see states having to follow through on their threats, right, that's a sign of failed diplomacy. It doesn't mean that there isn't conflict, but that conflict has now entered a different phase, and not so much a reflection of a state practicing a well-oiled set of policies, but rather blundering into something that's mutually costly. And that's what I want you to keep in mind. So when we're thinking about the broader context of energy and international relations, we have to remember a couple of things. One is that these states are trying to practice power and influence, either to coerce or to deter, within an interdependent relationship. Right? As we're going to talk about tomorrow with sanctions, right? Sanctions really work best against your friends, because you're trading something that you can withhold, right? The same thing here with energy broadly. Energy works within relationships that exist, all right? And so we need to think about not power versus interdependence, but it's power amid interdependent relationships, right? So when we look for asymmetries, or how do we understand who's influential in the broader interdependent relationships, okay? When we think about pipeline politics, empirically, it's very clear that there are cases of peace pipelines and conflict pipelines, right? And so it's a mixed bag. So what we need to understand is, why is it that some pipelines are prone to conflict and others aren't? Which leads us to focusing on what are the conditions surrounding a pipeline, right? And the interaction between the parties to a pipeline, rather than, again, just counting the resources, looking at who's supplying and who's dependent, right? And as a result, we need to look not just at the foreign policies of a particular country, but rather the conditions that shape their interaction, shape their choices, shape their perceptions of the other, the amount of information they have in engaging. Also, I would argue that for the most part, when we see competition and conflict, it's mostly on the commercial plane as opposed to on the geopolitical plane. Now, sometimes that, I mentioned, escalates, and I would argue for the most part inadvertently, into a geopolitical conflict. But we have to distinguish between commercial competitiveness and strategic competitiveness. And as a result, I think and what I want to try to convince you about doing, if there's one thing that you take away from today and tomorrow's session, is that this is a strategic affair. It's like really any conflict in international relations. Again, involving the motivations and preferences of different actors, the choices, the conditions under which they make those choices, the fact that they're dealing with imperfect information and uncertainty, and I would argue in the energy case, more risk than uncertainty, and how all those things come together to affect the choices that they make, because the outcomes conflict are a product of these choices and this interaction. And as a result, for the most part, we have what I would call security dilemmas. And those security dilemmas meaning that while one state seeks to increase its energy security, in some situations that can make other states' energy security much more precarious. Right? So it doesn't matter whether or not, in some cases, states have benign or aggressive intentions. It's the conditions that make it difficult for them to engage, even with the best of intentions. Okay? And there are some factors that exacerbate that dilemma or mitigate that dilemma. And that's what we'll talk a little bit about later today. Another thing to keep in mind is that these energy security dilemmas vary by sector. You know, I'm talking mostly today about gas, because there's a difference between gas and oil that I'll touch on. But that's something we need to think about. There are also different political institutions, the above ground factors that I were mentioning, that affect the value of the resource to different parties and the way that they conceive of their interests and preferences and what the others are doing, and how credibly they're able to signal to their rivals whether or not they're going to cut something off or not. Okay, and then time matters, right? Are we talking about a short-term episode that flares up and then calms down, or is it a long-term? And who has influence over whom may vary over time, as we'll talk more when we look at the Russian-European relationship. All right, so those are some of the basics of energy and diplomacy that you should keep in the back of your mind when we're thinking about Russia. Now, pipelines have, of course, been implicated as a fulcrum, if you will, of a lot of the conflicts. And this is for obvious reasons. These are fixed infrastructures that enjoy economies of scale. Think of these as, large diameter pipelines that actually traverse multiple borders. Right? So not one country or one entity, a company, or even consortia controls the legal environment and the rules for the pipeline. So this, just like when you're studying international relations versus domestic politics, right, this gets you into anarchy, right, uncertainties. You have to negotiate because there are different parties involved, right? And those parties involve the suppliers, right, the transit states. In the case of Russia and Eurasia to Europe, right, you have Ukraine and Belarus, and you also have downstream customers. The players are also not just states. There can be commercial actors, firms. So those firms can be owned by the state, or 51% owned by the state, Gazprom, or they can be completely private actors. They're not just firms, they're also regional governors, right? Because it depends on where the pipelines, right, flow and where they're constructed, right? They go over different jurisdictions. So there are a whole host of other players involved here, right? And pipelines are huge investments, right, that are fixed, and therefore they by definition, right, require government intervention. Now those governments can intervene directly by financing, right, or having their state entities, right, construct the pipeline, operate it, or they can create incentives, favorable loan and lending opportunities for private actors to step in. So governments, the markets don't work by themselves, largely because of the huge upfront costs, the uncertainties over time, the volatility of the markets and prices make it very difficult for pipelines to be constructed strictly by the market and purely with private actors. Governments have to intervene in some way or another. Right? And if nothing else, their legal jurisdiction gets implicated as we're talking about cross borders. So it's only natural that pipelines really become the focal point for looking at energy diplomacy and strategic interaction in the energy space. Plus, they're influenced by not only objective factors, how much, what the supply in terms of the resource base is versus the demand, the economic growth and demand requirements downstream. But like I mentioned, there are different political economic regimes that govern who the players are. Are they private, quasi-private, or state entities, the value of the resource, the conception of energy security. So pipelines not only are this fixed infrastructure, but they're informed by mixed motives among different players with different jurisdictions that have to reconcile their differences through interaction. And those differences also vary when you're talking about oil versus natural gas. Anybody know the difference, not just in terms of the molecules, but what's fundamentally the difference in the way that oil's traded versus natural gas until very recently?
You can put oil in a barrel.
You can put oil in a barrel, and what does that mean?
You can sell it to anyone.
You can sell it to anyone, you can deliver it through many different means, right? Pipelines, tankers, trucks. If you ever go to Chechnya or the Northern Caucasus, especially if you were there in the 90s, you see they could be very creative in the way that they siphon oil and deliver oil, right? Oil is a fungible commodity. And as a result, and this is where this sort of notion about energy independence becomes problematic, is that prices in one part of the world reverberate to another because oil can move to wherever the demand is. It's not locked into a particular type of infrastructure where there's a point-to-point relationship. So oil is what is called a fungible commodity. It exists in a globally integrated market. Now there's some different prices and there are different ways, and the prices are affected largely by the quality of the resource, and that gets into very technical issues, and they're different. There's the Brent price and the West Texas prices, but the point, for the most part, there's a globally integrated market. And with oil, actually, the real value is in the ground. It's the crude, right? Because there are so many different ways of shipping it, right? There are very small margins that exist. And so the real powerful ones, to the extent in an oil relationship, are the ones that actually have the resources. Okay, but because it's deliverable in a lot of different ways, anybody who has the resource can get into that market. And where there's a demand, there's going to be interest in selling to that. Okay, and now natural gas, on the other hand, is a much more regionally defined commodity, because until very recently, the lion's share, of natural gas, I'm talking in the 90% of natural gas, are delivered by pipelines, right? And these are very fixed infrastructure. You can't deliver it in other ways until recently with the advent of liquefied natural gas, right? And so therefore, the political economy of natural gas revolves around these fixed relationships that have to be negotiated, right? And therefore, natural gas has historically been traded through long-term contracts, because you're not going to build a pipeline unless you know you're going to get a return on your investment, right? So you're going to negotiate these things up front, taking into account, and accepting the volatility of prices. You're going to negotiate a price out into the future. So this isn't something that's just unique to Russia and what it does to Ukraine. You're going to do this all the time, right? Because of this fixed infrastructure there, which makes it so that there could be tremendous variation in terms of price in different regional markets based on the distance, the width, the diameter of the pipeline, the demand, or supply. There are a lot of factors that go into those long-term contracts. Okay, so and also in natural gas, the value therefore is distributed. Sure, there's a lot of value in the ground, but there's also value in the infrastructure itself. So the margins are vary along the stream. Okay, so as a result, there's been a focal point of looking at pipeline politics and vulnerabilities in those relationships, right? And because it's generally seen that, those parties, right, the resource nationalist view says that those parties that have the resources, right, that others want are in control, and why they can build the pipelines, so they can dictate where those pipelines are going to go, and they control the operation of it, right? They can turn the spigot off. So there are asymmetric vulnerabilities in these interdependent relationships. Sure, there's trading going on, but some have more leverage than others in this, and so we're likely to see more conflict over this. And so this is sort of the classic case of sort of conflict pipelines, Bolivia and Chile, Russia, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, etc. And this is why other non-state actors too want to target pipelines, ISIL, for example, and others. Now there's another school of thought that says, as I mentioned before, that pipelines are, again, the steel umbilical cord of mutual dependence, right? And that they're sources of peace. They can bring mutual benefits or mutual aversions to parties that want to avoid something like a disruption, right? Because pipelines, because of their physical infrastructure, and they require a lot of negotiation and actually trust to construct, are conducive for building and constructing rules of the road that allow parties to solve public goods problems like environmental security or energy security, right? And so, therefore, pipelines themselves become a route of cooperation. And so some people have said, for example, that why not build a pipeline from Baku through Nagorno-Karabakh to Europe? Because you can bring right, a set of mutual interests to parties that are otherwise in conflict. So there's been that discussion. But there have been cases between Italy and Libya, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, something that, notwithstanding what we see today, erupting. Egypt and Israel have actually had pipelines, relationships with each other. So there have been a bunch of sort of peace pipelines that have existed to forge this mutual interest. And really the mutual interest of a pipeline stems from the fact that everybody is concerned with return on investment, as well as avoiding these mutual bads of environmental and energy insecurity, right? Because once parties pony up, right, in the present, they need to get the returns in the future. And everybody, presumably, stands to benefit from that, right? Well, there's another school of thought that says, well, actually, pipelines are implicated in energy security because, well, it's not just the supplier and the customer. There's the transit state. And by the way, pipelines are very fixed. So the parties that invest a lot up front, right, who can dictate the direction of a pipeline or its viability at the inception, so they have a lot of power and influence up front because of their capital, lose that influence over time, because once they sink that capital into a fixed infrastructure, others can exploit that, right? Because they can't just sort of say, once they build that pipeline, they can't say, okay, I'm taking my pipeline and moving. I'm taking my capital. I mean, your capital is no longer flexible, right? So what happens, some people say the reason we have pipeline politics is because the middlemen, the transit states, who have less upfront costs at stake, now have more influence to disrupt, threaten, hey, to renege on their deals that said that they could use their territory or use the terms, right? And so this is the story of why some people say Ukraine, Belarus, they're the real problems in those pipelines coming from Russia to Europe, because they have been able to exploit the asymmetries of concern on return on investment. And oh, by the way, when you look at the former Soviet space, right, remember, and I'll show you images of pipelines that would come from Russia to Europe. But, when the Soviet Union collapsed, was everybody fixated on return on investment of those pipelines? No, the people that paid for those pipelines, first, it was not clear that they ever were using a commercial logic for building those pipelines. But whoever paid for it, the Soviet Union, was gone. So it's a very different game, right, than this traditional notion of building pipelines, putting capital, wanting mutual interest and return on investment. So this is why some people say that pipelines are inherently conflictual because of the shift in power between the investor up front and the transit states. Now, you can solve for that problem by giving the transit state a stake in the outcome and the delivery, right? So there's what's called offtake. So some of the contracts that exist not only allow for countries like Ukraine to get paid for using the transit rights, but they also get gas to help supply their needs. And so if that gas gets cut off, they also may be hurt in that situation. So there are ways to ameliorate that, but that is a bargaining issue. And others say that, well, it really has to do with the ways that countries conceive of energy and whether or not they have conflictual relationships to begin with, and therefore they project those conflicts onto the energy space, irrespective of the material interests of the return on investment issues. But just as there is the case with broader energy relations and international relations, there are a bunch of puzzles associated with pipeline politics. And in a nutshell, there's less conflict than the resource nationalists would expect. In other words, we do see peace pipelines that they can't explain. Similarly, there's more conflict than the interdependent school would acknowledge. And when we do look at the pipelines that have been disrupted, we see that for the most part, about 50% or a third of them, I should say, are due to purely technical reasons. Right? There's a problem with the flow, a problem with the with the compressors, etc. There are technical glitches into this that lead to stoppage. Like, for example, we saw most recently between Russia and Poland, right? A lot of people were thinking, oh, there's a big cutoff here, Russia, because of the acrimony between Poland and Russia, that this was a reflection of Gazprom playing pipeline politics, but really it had to do with some technical challenges with the compressors, and now it's flowing again. So that's a problem. Also, they're commercial issues as opposed to political issues, and so some studies that have looked at pipeline politics have said, like I mentioned, about a third of the cases can be ruled out for technical and commercial reasons. Most of the cases of any disruption, right, 50% of those, or I'm sorry, 2/3 of those cases that do exist exist between the same parties. In other words, there are multiple pipelines. So it has to do with pre-existing tensions between those parties, as opposed to pipelines bringing an independent driver of conflict. So that's a problem. It also presents a number of bargaining problems. Those of you who study bargaining issues, and I know there's somebody that's going to be talking about it, you know, one of the challenges with bargaining in international relations is the uncertainty, right? And this notion that you don't know if you're going to be interacting with a party again in the future, and therefore there's an incentive to get all that you can up front, right? And if you could solve for the shadow of the future, in other words, if you convince each other that you're going to be interacting over time, then there's less of an incentive to be predatory and more of an incentive to realize mutual interest and cooperation, right? Tit for tat, or something like this. And so you would think, when it comes to energy pipelines and infrastructure, this should be an easy solvable problem because of the huge demands for return on investment, right? The fact that you cannot play around. It's not easy to turn off a pipeline. Because of the amount of compression in the pipelines. You cannot just readily turn it on or off, right, without risking an explosion that would be deadly for all parties, right? So there's that reason. There's a technical reason to not want to do this. Pipelines are a reflection of a long-term confidence relationship. You don't build a pipeline unless you have the confidence that you're going to have a relationship for the future, right? Pipelines themselves embody long-term repeated or reciprocal interactions. So there's very little uncertainty about who you're going to be dealing with, especially with a natural gas pipeline, because it's already there. It's a manifestation of who the parties are. So that's a problem. And there are, another argument about bargaining is that, well, it's easier. One of the reasons we don't have peace in the Middle East, right, and Palestine is that both parties put equal value on a territory that is indivisible. In other words, it's all or nothing for both parties with the territories. With pipelines, they're different players. There are a lot of divisible dimensions to building a pipeline and solving the interests of the various parties that I mentioned. So again, this should be readily solvable. This should not be really an instrument of statecraft or conflict, yet we see conflict and disruptions in some of them and not others. So how is it that we explain that? And I would argue, again, that it has more to do with thinking strategically, right, and about the preferences, choices, information. In other words, how much you understand what the other side's doing, how confident you can be in the other side, right? The conditions that excite those anxieties versus mitigate those anxieties, and that ultimately are a product of the choices that are made by the different parties, right? So it's the circumstances, the actions of the others, or the choices, the extent to which there are information symmetries. And I would argue that you're more likely to have pipeline conflict when the parties, or at least one party, fears that their long-term benefits of cooperation will not be realized by the other side. In other words, the other side will not follow through on its promises. So you have arbitrary disruptions either driven by one party to exploit advantages or fears of the weaker party that the other side will exploit them. So there's uncertainty and anxiety associated with that uncertainty. And that leads to classic issues of commitment problems. In other words, if pipelines, as I mentioned, are long-term projects, right, to get that return, so you need to be confident today that you're going to reap the benefits tomorrow. And if you're not confident and that other side can't reassure you right, then you're going to have these arbitrary disruptions. And I would argue that there's some factors that increase or decrease the intensity of those credible commitment problems that then lead parties that may mutually benefit from delivering gas or oil from one part of the world to another part of the world may find themselves blundering into conflict inadvertently. All right? And I would argue that it's not just uncertainty when it comes to energy. And this is where it's slightly different than a traditional bargaining problem. There's risk. You know, when you talk to an oiler, right, you're from Texas, when you talk to, these guys are, you know, leathernecks, right? They're like, they like risk. Why? Because they're like the cleanup batter in a baseball game. They're swinging for the fences, right? It's all about, they're willing to take hits, right? Because it's all about the payoff in down the road. So there may be high finding costs, right? They're willing to, you know, the big oil companies, especially in energy companies, they don't go for the small dink and dunk fields, right? They're not looking at measuring costs, benefits, uncertainty, you know, like you and I may when we're making our investments. They're like, all right, we can take costs, we can take the hit, and we can justify it to our board of directors and all of our stockholders because the payoff is going to be huge. And so we're going to go in the most dangerous areas where, you know, where the payoffs are greatest. That's why, you know, they're willing to go to all of these places. And you see the big companies involved in the big plays, right? Little companies can't afford to take all those hits. And so it's about risk, right? Also, it's the gap. It's not just weighing costs, benefits, and marginally better off. They don't want that. They want where the benefits are going to be really high and the costs can be really high too. So it's going to be that spread that matters to them, right? And that's really a risk, right? And so therefore, you know, when we're talking about bargaining, when countries, and also they have different market power. When we think about bargaining between players, right, some have resources, some have a lot of capital to invest. As I mentioned, the wealthier tend to want to go for the bigger plays. They tend to want, they're going to disregard like smaller players' interests because they're going to shoot for the fences. Smaller players are worried that their interests aren't going to be taken into consideration. And they may see their best situation is today because tomorrow the big players are going to suck up all the oxygen and all the resources, right? So there are acute senses of opportunity and vulnerability in these energy interactions. And the more there is a concentration of market power, the more acute these risk calculations become. This is compounded by the political environment within which each country structures its energy relationships. In other words, in some countries there's a very coherent regulatory system, right? There's one player, maybe a state entity, that controls all exports, right? You only have to deal with that one player. And so when you're negotiating, it's really just understanding what the interests are of that one player. Others states there are redundant, overlapping authorities. There's a very confused amalgam, right, of players and interests. So it's hard for an outsider to understand what the interests are and have confidence that they're going to uphold a bargain that they make today, tomorrow. So this institutional opacity, the more confused, the more obfuscated the domestic institutions of energy regulations are and your adversary, the more difficult it is going to be for you to for them to send clear signals and for you to discern clear signals. And so that creates that credible commitment problem. So you have risk and this credible commitment problem. So the more concentrated the market power is and the more confused the domestic regulatory system is, the more prone to pipeline politics, the more conflict prone we are. Okay? Now I'm a very simple mind, I'm very simple. I see the world in sort of 2x2 matrices. Some of my colleagues and some of the others you're going to have are very complex. They see all these different players. For me, the world is very simple when you start looking at these market and institutional variables. You're either going to have very conflict-prone pipelines where there's market concentration in opaque political institutions, or alternatively, if you have symmetrical bargaining power and very transparent institutions, this is going to be ripe for peace pipelines. And you can have some situations where there may be symmetry, but there's confusion, and so parties can blunder into something and precipitously have a short-term conflict. And alternatively, you can still have conflict, and it's just that the stronger want to work their will over others. And there, to the extent that you have conflict, the parties aren't blundering into it. One party knows exactly what they're doing, the other knows what they're doing too. Yeah. Yeah.
Talking to me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. When you're talking about the opaque regulatory environment, you're mostly talking about the suppliers, right?
No, on all sides, right? If you can't send clear signals, right? The supplier may be worried that a customer is going to shift away and not buy gas at the price that they had negotiated, right? So therefore, they're going to be more prone to try to act unilaterally. And if they have another opportunity or an opportunity to exploit their advantages, they may renege on a deal because they're worried. They want to beat the weaker customer to the point of reneging.
So it's the term of contract, really.
Right. It has to do with who the players are, what the distribution of authority is within their regulatory system, and how clearly they're able to send signals. So the more coherent, if there's one actor, right, that's easy to negotiate with. If there are multiple actors that have multiple authorities, overlapping authorities, so you don't know, there are multiple claimants, right, of a resource, like a regional, governor claims the resource just as the U.S. government does, and they're contesting it over. For the outsiders to negotiate over that resource, they don't know if the federal government strikes a deal with them, if that'll be honored because the governor may undermine it, right? So that's what I'm talking about. And so what you see when you look really since the early 1990s is that you can put the different pipeline relationships in this simple 2x2 matrix. Okay, matrix. And actually, when we look specifically, I would argue at the sort of the Russia pipelines to Europe, right? I would argue that the 2006 and 2009 pipeline crises were just simply overdetermined. They were in that bottom left cell, right? They're right here. You had a situation where Russia, at least in 2006 and 2006, right, had tremendous advantage and was facing a period of rising oil prices, right, and the price of gas was pegged to the oil prices. They were also buying Central Asian gas at high prices, and they wanted to work their will over Ukraine, which was heavily dependent on what was going on. And if those of you who studied anything about Ukraine and Russia political economy know that there are a lot of sort of opaque players, dark forces on both sides, not clear. Even Putin got frustrated with bargaining because it wasn't clear who the main players were. Gazprom threw up its hands in Ukraine. So you had a lot of opacity on both sides that led to, in 2006, looking back, I mean, there was a debate over a battle over price. And it precipitously escalated into a conflict that actually hurt it hurt all parties. 2009, you had a more protracted situation. I would argue there, you still had, Russia had obviously more resources, and you had a growing demand in Ukraine for those resources, given both the combination of their declining economic situation as well as a very opaque political situation. But Russia was saddled, this is a period where oil prices were going down, but Russia was saddled with buying Central Asian gas at a high price, so they needed to offload that burden. And that was a very costly cutoff, and that was costly for all parties. Russia actually paid pretty heavily, so did the Europeans. They paid rather significantly too, as you can see in this this chart, but I mean, this was mutually costly. Not only did these countries see import cutoffs, but Russia obviously lost significant revenues, right? Its reputation took a grave hit. It actually provoked the EU to get serious about its energy reforms and diversification and increasing the credibility of EU institutions to dictate the terms for selling gas into the European Union. And obviously it was costly for Ukraine that suffered the loss of the transit fees that they were getting, as well as gas that was desperately needed during that period. So that was a very conflict-prone situation, largely due to the fact that I would argue that you're mostly in that bottom left situation. Now, if you want to contrast that to the Nord Stream pipeline, the first stream, right, that took place between Russia, delivering Russia to the German port, and then through the undersea pipeline. I mean, this was, from the onset, this was seen to be, dead on arrival, right? There were huge economic costs and uncertainty to building this pipeline, long, undersea pipeline, a lot of technical difficulties, very expensive, not clear what the market was going to be for the gas. Of course, this is a fixed pipeline, so there were concerns that, what happens if their alternative suppliers come online? Iran, maybe there would be problems with Iran, or Iraq would dissipate, so they would be new suppliers. There were fears, of course, that Russia would work its will, exploit this pipeline once it got up and running, right? The Poles called it the equivalent of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? This was like this is complete appeasement to Russia. Sweden thought that they would use their offshore compressor stations as points of not only intelligence gathering, but for probing, the sort of kinds of things we see now with active measures that we talk about today. Environmentally, this was seen to be a disaster, and that there was what was the legal arrangement, because there are all these different dimensions to the sea. They don't all fall under the law of the sea. There are different protocols. So, how is this going to be sorted out? So this was going to be dead on arrival, but yet we see the pipeline was constructed, and although it operated under capacity until very recently, it was not cut off for any reasons. So the parties were able to transcend these economic, environmental, and strategic costs up front and not seen a disruption. Now, there's a debate about the Nord Stream 2, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But the game has changed, right? There are new players, right? During this period, Poland and some of the other countries were really just, when this negotiation over Nord Stream 1 started, they were not really participants in that negotiation in the EU context. They were fearful of it, but they were really minor players. LNG and the price of oil. Two different phenomena that changed the nature of what was going on. Obviously, the Ukraine crisis has excited concerns about Russia's strategic manipulation. The EU has now a very different set of regulations, and it's the competition directorate is now quite significant, has a lot of soft power, can set prices, set terms of delivery into the EU that it didn't have before. So the situation for Nord Stream 2 that they're debating today is very different than in Nord Stream 1, and you had much more symmetry in market power, and it was very clear because all the players were focused on return on investment. This is a brand new pipeline, very expensive. Gazprom had a huge stake in making this work. Any disruptions would be very costly to Gazprom that was putting up a lot of the capital. So you had a very transparent set of relationships. Russia signed on to a number of the environmental protocols. They agreed to accept the European Union as the arbiter. Now, they may have a different position on the issues, but they accepted that the European Union had jurisdiction to shape the prices and the terms of delivery, and they made their case for Nord Stream 2 in the court of law, as opposed to working its will outside of the legal framework. So, very different situation. I would argue that it's because it's been primarily in that upper right-hand situation. All right, so that's some background on energy diplomacy, and pipeline politics. Now let's shift gears a little bit to the Russia dimension. And, you know, for the most part, and this is sort of the essence of the Russian energy strategy today to 2035. And, you know, it's important to note a couple of things about Russian and energy. One, it's not been a static dimension of their foreign policy, or their strategy has not been static. You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and really up through 2012, the focus really was on energy as a driver of the economy, driver of their foreign policy, driver of their efforts to reclaim lost geostrategic grandeur, right? Energy was the fulcrum, right, of their developmental model and their geostrategy. It has changed, really, over the last several years, where it is now seen to be a critical support system, a facilitator of Russia's efforts. And their focus has really been less on extraction and more on technological innovation. And that Russia's transition from a petrostate to to economic developed state requires energy contributing, but energy through investments, through technological innovation, not through extraction, okay, to drive the economy. So the dynamism of the sectors to drive the dynamism of the broader economy. And therefore, they put some different priorities, right? For oil, it's really, oil, by the way, is where the Russians earn their real hard currency, right? Even though gas is really the lifeblood of Russian and this dependent relationships, they don't earn a lot, but because there are a lot of costs associated, and they subsidize their market at home. So it's actually, for Gazprom, sometimes for many years it was a losing enterprise, right? Because they had to, the state forced them to sell to the Far East, isolated areas, the North Caucasus, at a discount. So they make a lot of money on oil exports. So what they've wanted to do is maintain oil exports. But one thing about Russia that you have to keep in mind, and I'll talk about in a moment, is that, you know, while they sell a lot of oil, they don't control the market, okay, the global market. So the goal has been to pretty much stabilize the oil sector and to increase over time to about 20% of their production and about 40% of their exports from new fields in East Siberia and the Far East. So they're moving, they want to move farther east. Gas, but to stabilize that production. For gas, the goal is really to increase production dramatically, about 30 to 45%, and decrease the production coming out of East Siberia and the Far East by about 15 to 20%, and to increase their exports to about 35 to 40%. And they also want to get into the LNG business, something that they've been very slow to get in. They're historically delivered gas through big pipelines, and so they want to become, they want to control about 8 to 11% of the total deliveries or total production of liquefied natural gas, and basically increasing it about 3 to 4 times what they do today by 2035. Okay. Now, there have been a number of challenges that they face. Well, here, this gives you a sense. This is ripped from their plan. You can see when it comes to oil, there are some huge risk factors. So their scenarios vary tremendously, but you can see that they want to really maintain production, and they want to decrease exports to the CIS. They want to increase exports to the Far East and kind of maintain exports to Europe. When it comes to natural gas, right, they have much tighter margins here, and it's really about diversifying their delivery through pipelines and through LNG. But as I mentioned, there have been a number of challenges. One, they have not met a lot of their investment targets. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's been a problem. There's been a depreciation of the capital assets in the existing fields. About 60 and 80% of their existing infrastructure needs to be reinvested and renewed. They don't have a supply chain for developing the technology for a lot of the unconventional production and LNG, so they have to rely on imports of those technologies, hence those with sanctions in place, that has been a challenge for them. Consumer prices, right, have been historically low and subsidized when it comes to natural gas. Oil prices they've let go, but natural gas they've creeped up, but with the crisis of Ukraine they've gone back down again, and they've projected out farther when they're going to allow world market prices to natural gas. And also, we'll mention, there's been a rise of competition among gas producers for not only markets at home, but also to export. So this has caused a lot of challenges in realizing that set of objectives. Another thing to note about Russia's energy diplomacy is that at the strategic level, it's been a point of rare political consensus really since the collapse of the Soviet Union, even during the heyday of the rough and tumble of Russian politics with Yeltsin. There was a consensus that energy was critical not only to development but to their foreign policy, right? And therefore they wanted to control ownership, development, and export of the sector. Now, one thing to note is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, one of the first sectors to be privatized was the oil sector. But the gas sector they maintained state control over. And over time they re-statized the oil sector, Rosneft being the largest. But there's still a number of private oil companies. They're just now starting to see Novatek and Rosneft, this oil companies, getting into gas, because when you drill for oil, there you have gas that you're flaring off, and now since Rosneft has all this production, they have a lot of gas that they're dealing with, and they want to monetize that. Okay, but while there's been consensus that energy is a fulcrum of development and foreign policy, again, since the Yeltsin period, there's been a variety of tactics that they've used. Some very coercive, some more accommodating. So if you look at the Caspian Sea, which was really where a lot of the energy diplomacy was playing out in the 90s, you saw at times they were trying to extort and extract and practice naval diplomacy vis-a-vis the other littoral states. But the other times they were able to reach compromises over who owns the seabed versus the sea columns versus the surface, where they've encouraged their private companies like Lukoil to get involved in these multiple pipeline deals that actually bypass Russia. Okay, they practice price discrimination relationships, really since inception. I mean, this is not new to Putin, right? Yeltsin did it too, and they look to extract the debt. Some of the CIS countries owed Russia a big debt, and they would, rather than taking the liquidity and repayments, they wanted to get ownership over the energy distribution system, like in Armenia or Moldova, Belarus, and Ukraine has resisted that. But that effort to get these debt equity swaps has been there really since the very beginning. This is not new to Putin. That said, Putin has brought a sense of stewardship to the space, where really energy and energy companies and this whole notion of vertical integration and using energy as a locomotive for the driver of the economy. That was really encapsulated best by Putin in his dissertation, if you can find it. That's allegedly what he wrote on, or someone wrote on. And this was really manifest in the Lavrov Doctrine in 2006, where Russia was seen to use and declared that energy was an important part of its competitive advantage in dealing with its exclusive zone of priority, which is the NIS, and the basis of really standing up to the Western competition. So this was really, energy was really, brought to the fore as part of their geopolitical mettle in dealing with the West. But Putin himself has varied his tactics, just as Yeltsin did. All right, and most recently, there's been a focus less on extracting prices per deal on gas in particular, but getting market share, willing to sell gas at a lower price. because Russia's margins are very high, right? Russia, remember, the Soviet Union invested in these huge oil fields and gas fields. So they're not worried about return on investment. So their margins are actually, they have marginal cost advantages that, notwithstanding all the discussion about unconventional production in the United States, is still very costly. The reason we're having unconventional shale production, tar sands production in the United States is because the price was very high. It allowed these new technologies to be brought to the fore. But as prices have come down, that's put a pressure on American companies that are operating with much larger costs. Russia, they're basically creaming off of Soviet investments. So in a low price environment, they can actually be a strong competitor. Now, granted, they're going to take a hit on the revenues that they get, but the notion is that they drive out competitors, increase their market share, and then when price goes up, they're in an advantage to extract more. So that's been one of the parts of Putin's strategy. Another one is to diversify the export pipelines to Europe, playing off the different interests of the EU member states, Nord Stream, Turkish Stream, South Stream, all of these different pipelines. They've also tried to not just get involved in selling gas and ownership and operation of the pipelines. They want to own and operate storage facilities, LNG facilities, penetrate, if you will, so that they are a part of the European Union in terms of the equities that they have. And then obviously have a competitive division of labor between Gazprom that controls exports to Europe through pipelines versus creating incentives for private actors like Novatek or even Rosneft to get involved in exporting natural gas to LNG and especially to emerging markets like in Asia, right? So that's been a focal point. That said, there are a number of myths about Russia's energy diplomacy I want you to keep in mind. And I won't go into all of these, but bottom line is, we talk about Russia as an energy superpower, but when we look at it, it's really, until very recently, been a gas regional power. As I mentioned before, oil is an integrated global market, and as a result, Russia's a price taker when it comes to oil. Saudi Arabia, even though Russia on any one particular day may sell more oil in the market, they don't have a surplus. They don't have what's called swing potential, where they take things off. They depend on that oil for their revenues, right? So they can't just withhold a lot and do well, right? Saudi Arabia has very, very low margins, and they have a lot of oil. So they can dump a lot of oil at cheap prices, drive people out, or they can withhold their oil and increase the prices. Okay, but they can swing that production and the amount of production that has a global impact on prices. Russia really can't do that. So that's a problem. But when it comes to natural gas, as I mentioned in these regionally divided transactions, historically Russia has actually had a lot of leverage. That said, they've had a number of problems. And if we look at, this is basically the distribution of the Russian resource base. And the Soviet Union spent the time developing these Western Siberian fields, right? And these are the emerging greenfield opportunities. But one of the problems that Russia has is that all that infrastructure was built around Western Siberia and very little around Eastern Siberia. So huge startup costs to extracting. So even if you could invest in developing these fields though are smaller than these fields were. Okay, Gazprom's business has all been based on extracting these resources through pipelines that go to Europe, right? These are the biggest green fields available, but they're smaller than this, and there's no infrastructure there. So you're going to have to pay for that infrastructure in remote areas, delivering to the Far East that has a smaller demand than Europe. So for Gazprom, right, they have a situation where there's oversupply. They have a lot of gas. Right? They can still continue to cream off of Soviet investments, and there's some new fields in the Arctic, but they're over here in West Siberia. Their problem isn't gas, it's getting the right price for their gas. Plus they're saddled with a bunch of state obligations to provide gas at a discount. So they don't really have a huge incentive to develop these green fields. Plus going to China where their infrastructure is not built up. right? And LNG is not playing to their strength. They're a pipeline company. But some of the new companies, they're keen on getting involved in developing these things as long as they can export it. And they want to get out of Gazprom's control over pipelines, so they're encouraged by LNG, right? So that's, and Rosneft wants to sell this gas to Russia once the prices go up. Another problem is that everybody talks about this dependency relationship as if it's a one-way deal, but as we talked about before, Europe is highly dependent, not only highly dependent on Russian gas, but Russia is very dependent on getting the returns for the gas sold. I mean, because really it used to be 100%, but now it's about 75% of the gas is exported to Europe. Okay, 20% of Gazprom's production goes to Europe, and it earns 65 to 70% of their revenues. Okay, so you can see the value to Gazprom of selling to Europe. So that's an issue to keep in mind. You know, there's dependencies vary within Europe. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. But it's not, when we talk about Europe, it's not one entity. There's a variation. The Baltic states and Poland, Slovakia, right, differ very much. Even though Germany buys more gas than any of those parties, Germany's not dependent, import dependent, right, based on the amount of their percentage of imports. So it varies. Also, there are different ways of measuring this dependency, not just looking at import dependence, but you can look at how many other options you have versus your consumption, and you know, sort of, you see that there's a variety of dependencies here. The bottom line is also it's mutual, and this is one of the things I mentioned to you before. Over time matters too. If you look at the specific dyadic relationships, you can see that sure, Russia is in a driver's seat up early on, but even in all across relations, it starts to pay a cost, right, of practicing energy diplomacy. In fact, you start seeing advantages that other states begin to have. The EU, for example, over time begins to, even Ukraine over time can exert pressure, and that can have a boomerang effect for Russia. So there's mutual dimension to that. Another one is that there's, you know, we used to impose this sort of what's good for GM is good for the country, right? That's what the US motto was, and what's good for Nash Dom Gazprom, right, is good for the country. But in fact, there have historically been a lot of tensions between Gazprom and the state, and increasingly there have been tensions between Gazprom and these emerging gas suppliers. Novatek, as I mentioned, is very keen on selling LNG to Europe, which would then, the Gazprom argues, would compete against their gas that would be sold by pipelines. And Rosneft is keen to sell increasingly to East Asia and at home. Which causes a lot of problems. But there have been historic battles over ownership and control, and these opaque forces within Gazprom where investments have been lost or lined certain pockets. And we can talk a little bit about this later, but East Asia is right. Talk about the Russian pivot, selling more and more gas to Asia. Well, the problem is that Asia is primarily LNG. They don't depend on pipeline gas. They depend on this competitive LNG market. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But bottom line is that's not playing to Russia's strengths. China's practicing a hedging strategy. China doesn't want to be looking to Russia to create a steel umbilical cord of dependence. In fact, they buy gas from Central Asia, from Myanmar. They're involved in a lot of other plays. They wouldn't mind buying gas from Russia, but you know, they're not going to tie themselves there. And as I mentioned, Russia has grandiose visions of selling a resource and gas to East Asia, but that's not playing to their strengths. Their infrastructure is oriented now to the West, and the Chinese are very keen about buying, you know, developing fields in East Siberia and Far East that are not, where Russia can't play games, where they can say this resource can be, if you don't give us the right price, we're going to sell that resource to Europe. They want to develop those new fields that are tied to East Asia. So it's not clear that there's a real Asian pivot there that can be exploited. And we talked a little bit about what is energy diplomacy? Is it a sign of failure when they cut off pipelines? And not all of these pipeline conflicts have been politically motivated. And there have been and this just shows you the different plans, right, between the different companies and how Gazprom is facing increasing competition, especially when it comes to LNG. And Gazprom has really not been able to realize its ambitions in LNG, largely because of these investment purposes, and they have an oversupply now. They're not keen to invest in that, as opposed to Novatech. And that the policies that they've pursued have been varied. They rely on subsidies, not just threats of cutoffs to influence others. In fact, there have been very few cutoffs, as I mentioned. All right, so let's briefly touch on the Ukraine crisis, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow. But one of the real puzzles, really, since 2013 is that notwithstanding the dismemberment of Ukraine and the intense conflicts that we've seen and the difficulties in establishing the Minsk getting traction for the Minsk Accords, gas really has continued to flow. In fact, over the last 2 years, Russia has increased by 20% each year the amount of gas that it ships from Russia to the EU. Right? So even in a period of these low prices where where the world's awash in natural gas and there's a conflict going on and arguably our relations have hit a low ebb since the collapse of the Soviet Union, gas has continued to flow and increased, actually. Similarly, Ukraine, you can see during critical periods, has continued to buy natural gas. And as I explained in the article that I gave you, the cutoffs really since 2014 have really been mostly at Ukraine's behest rather than Russia sort of cutting it off unilaterally, because they've had alternative supplies, as you've been able to see. So this relationship has actually been relatively stable, notwithstanding the conflicts on other planes. And, okay, what are we talking about in terms of restraint? Well, one, they're honoring their commitments. They're not doing what they're doing in other dimensions, like, this is a classic, this is dated already, all these provocative incidents of drive-bys, fly-bys, where if you read the newspaper, right, the helicopter buzzed the American embassy official driving. There are all of these incidents of provocation, notwithstanding, or not to mention the what's going on in eastern Ukraine, and Syria. So relative to that, this has been very stable and demonstrated restraint. Also relative to the 2006-2009 precipitous escalations of crises that were very costly to all parties, all parties have actually demonstrated restraint. And Russia, people tend to forget in the very beginning of this crisis, if Russia was so intent on using gas as a weapon to bring Ukraine to its knees, why, and to get Europe's attention, why did, just as they're dismembering Ukraine, they decide to pay ahead and pay in advance for their delivery of gas to ship? They repaid a debt. They prepaid forward every year since the crisis to Ukraine. So if they were going to be playing these games, why would they prepay and then risk being held hostage? Okay, so people tend to forget that. And they've reached different compromises. Similarly, and they've also taken their grievances to court, to the Stockholm International Tribunal and the EU regulation. So they're making their case within the rules of the game, not taking their sheets and blankets and going home, right? So that's one thing. Similarly, Ukraine has also been played. They've resisted disrupting transit. In fact, they sent, during their battles with Russia over Crimea and the long-standing tensions in eastern Ukraine, they've actually they've sent troops to protect the Russian pipeline traversing the country. Okay, so they too have stood up in protecting those things. They've accepted compromise package deals. And the EU too has tried to provide good offices and not pushed, like for example, when the Nord Stream pipeline comes into Germany, it needs to go somewhere, right? And there's a pipeline connector, the Opal pipeline. Well, that one clearly falls under EU jurisdiction, and that says you have to have, no one company can control more than 50%. And at times Gazprom was trying to do that. Well, the EU could have said from the very beginning, guess what, you can't have access to that Opal pipeline, and that would have just terminated all of those investment opportunities for Gazprom. But the EU said, let's take this to court, and when there was the most intense flare-ups in the crisis with Ukraine, they said, you know what, now's not the time to settle this issue. Let's kick this down the road. So the EU has actually tried to participate constructively. And there have been a bunch of situations. They haven't extracted themselves out of tensions, so there's always the fear, especially as winter comes around, that there's going to be a cutoff. But there hasn't been. And to the extent that the gas has stopped flowing, as I mentioned, Ukraine has said, we don't want to purchase, we're not going to purchase that gas that we contracted for because somebody else is going to supply it. So it's not been Russia necessarily cutting those things off. But there is this looming threat of arbitrary disruption. So they're not out of this relationship. And this relationship is costly for all. This is a compromise. Russia obviously is not getting the profits that they had wanted. Having to negotiate the price downward, right? They actually the settlement of the Stockholm court just came out. They lost on all three accounts. In other words, they are going to have to receive a lower price. They're going to have to allow their gas to be re-exported. They can't control where it comes from. They had this thing called bundling, or they had what was called destination clauses, where they would sign a contract with you and say, you have to buy all of this gas and you can't re-export this gas. So even if you don't need it, you're still going to have to buy it at this price, and you're going to have to just suck it up. And the other countries were saying, no, one, we're not going to buy it at that price, and two, we're going to re-export it because we don't need it, but Austria may need it or some other country may need it, so we're going to re-export it. And Gazprom said, no, that was a violation. Well, the EU said, guess what, Gazprom, you're out, all right, because we want diversification, liberalization. So Russia, lost this court battle recently, and they're waiting to hear what the damages are for Ukraine. The Ukraine, they enter each winter season with their supply stocks not fully filled. So there's a risk that things could get cut off. There's obviously the threat of Nord Stream 2 coming in and circumventing them, or Turkish Stream, the two of them being a pincer movement around them. So that's been hard. And of course the EU has had internal dissension. There's been Poland and the Baltic states have been worried about Russia, as opposed to Bulgaria and Hungary, as well as Germany has been kind of in the middle. And of course there's been this crisis. Now, and Russia has paid a price, right? When the crisis started, prices were around $100 a barrel, and really they've dropped. Where are they now? Anybody know where oil prices are? Yeah, about $45. So, it's creeping up, and their budgets now have been pegged to that. But early on, they were suffering serious damage here. In addition, they lost a big source of revenue, right, with the Ukraine, as Ukraine began to diversify. And you can see how this is tracked. Low oil prices have actually hurt Russia dramatically. You can see how their GDP decline is tracked with low oil prices. So as others have been able to fill the gap, that has hurt them. So this has been an uncomfortable situation for Russia. And Ukraine too. They can't basically get off of Russia's supply without making some fundamental reforms at home. Okay, so that's the situation we are. And a couple things before I end that you should know, and we'll talk about these next time, that the situation is changing. Right? As I mentioned, this was this precarious, costly, risky status quo, risk of precipitous flare-ups every year, but they don't really happen. Why is that? Well, I would argue that the landscape that all of this is taking place against is changing. Okay, and there are a couple of global trends that I want you to keep in mind, and this will then inform how we think about another way of thinking about foreign influence in the gas sector tomorrow. But one thing is, look where the demand is. All right, the real demand for natural gas is coming from where? The non-OECD countries, as opposed to the. They're all. It's global, and it's taking place. And what real drivers are the non-OECD countries, and they're different. The OECD relies on natural gas for generating power and electricity, and non-OECD looks heavily at gas for for industry, industrial development. Another thing is that for the first time we're beginning to see GDP and energy start to diverge. And this shows the general growing efficiencies in the global system, especially in the OECD countries. And you see for the first time, right, there's no dominant energy sector. Right? It used to be oil was by far the most important for generating electricity and power. Right? Now it's others. Gas has increasingly become prominent, right? So there's no one sector that's sort of calling the shots, if you will. We look at supply, that has also begun to change, right? And the type of supply has also changed, right? Most of the shale and unconventional growth has taken place in the OECD. The non-OECD countries still rely heavily on conventional natural gas. And that is, and you know, the U.S. of course is one of the big stories here on the unconventionals, where it's grown tremendously, as we'll mention. But the real drivers down the road are going to be a combination of the U.S., North America, including Canada, and China, okay, with their potential reserves. So that's shifting. In addition, you're seeing, right, we have very different profiles in the prospects for unconventionals, right? Very high in North America, China to a growing extent, but Europe is really not going to be a major player in this new unconventional space. So they're going to be importing a lot of natural gas. They're not going to be developing their own resources. So this notion that Ukraine or Poland can get themselves off this fix with Russia, it will be solved by shale prospecting, is really not going to be manifest there. Also, we're seeing a changing political geography of supply and demand, right? You know, what defined the global system really prior to 2008 or so was that you had certain areas of the world produced the resources and other areas of the world consumed the resources. So you relied on these cross-border flows. But now, think of North America. We consume a lot, but we also produce a lot. Right? Similarly, China is going to be like that down the road. Europe is going to go like this in terms of their production and growing consumption. So we're having a very different political geography of supply and demand. At the same time, we're also seeing, and this is what we'll talk more about next time, a technological revolution, and the rise of LNG, which I mentioned to you before, is going to change the way that oil and gas is supplied. However, LNG is not going to be the dominant way that gas is supplied. Pipelines are still going to be about 60% of the action and a growing percentage in Europe. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. We're also beginning to see an emergence of a global gas market, as opposed to these regional markets where we're seeing price convergence. There's still variation, but we're seeing more convergence in prices as they're being, as LNG is penetrating Europe and others. Now, the U.S. is really going to be a story of unconventionals and shale, right, and LNG. That's where the U.S. Excitement is. But that's very costly, right? It's cheap to deliver natural gas. Well, natural gas is more expensive to prospect in the United States because shale requires a larger investment, okay, in different types of technologies. But once you get it online, you're delivering it to the United States, which is, basically they've worked out a lot of the regulatory processes, and we have the lowest LNG prices. Right? But when you start shipping, if you need to ship that abroad, right, that gets very expensive, right? Turning that natural gas into LNG, freezing it basically, shipping it, and then unfreezing it, it gets very expensive. And so while we have an abundance of natural gas, it's very costly for us to export it. Although, as you're seeing with more competition, right, and more LNG facilities being developed and LNG playing a bigger role, right, that plays more to our advantage and allows us to come in and potentially sell gas. So a lot of people have said that this could be our new energy weapon, is that we can use our gas exports, right? But one thing to keep in mind is that it is still costly for the U.S. to do that, especially relative to Russia. As we mentioned, they had all those sunk costs and very close, already has the infrastructure built out. So that's a challenge. But you're going to see the U.S. sort of overtaking Qatar and Australia being the rising source of LNG. Also, Africa is going to emerge from being a supplicant to a potential supplier region. So those are some things to keep in mind. But ultimately, I would argue, when you're thinking about a country like Russia, there are two big phenomenal issues that are happening that are going to constrain it. One is this U.S. production that creates optionality, right? Right, so the U.S., different prices, it's going to affect our volumes and availability. The other thing, of course, is China's demand, right? As China's economic growth increases, right, that's going to, and they've, since the 90s, mid-90s, they have now become import dependent on natural gas. They require some imports. As their economy booms, right, that is going to affect their demand. So there's a supply and a demand constraint. Now, on the other hand, China's economy, as we're seeing now, is not realizing that potential. Is flattened out a little bit, which has led to a lot of surplus capacity. So I would argue, when we're thinking strategically about Russia, again, my simple mind in thinking in 2x2 terms, Russia's capacity to play pipeline politics is fundamentally constrained by factors that they can't control. U.S. production, the cost of U.S. production, and one of the real miracles of the shale revolution, surprised everybody, was that costs have gone down for prospecting, because shale, unlike conventional things, can be turned on and off very quickly. So the U.S. can withstand, and there's a lot of technological innovation. Now shale, you basically are going down, right, and you're cutting over, and then what they've done is they've fracked. There are multiple fracks off of a main drill. So that's helped to increase the amount of extraction per investment. So shale that's become a very dynamic, technologically innovative sector that has allowed the U.S. producers to stay in the game, right? That's something that Russia can't control, right? And they can't control China's growth patterns. So in a situation, right, where China's, where the U.S. production is very high, right, and China's demand is very low, right, Russia is going to have a trouble. There's no, the U.S. can deliver at lower prices, and China's not going to absorb, the Russian surplus. On the other hand, when the U.S. production is low and China's demand is high, that's a great opportunity for Russia to practice its energy diplomacy, right? And then there's some middle zones where they may have some ability to play on the margins, right? Especially in a situation where there's low demand but also low competition. All right, so the big picture again takes us back to the environmental consideration, the conditions under which Russia practices its energy diplomacy. Just like in oil, I would argue that Russia is constrained by factors that they can't control. Ultimately, it's the decisions affecting the U.S. production and exports and the decisions affecting Chinese demand. Those are big macro level factors that over the medium and long term sort out any hiccup that may be existent due to other reasons. All right, so tomorrow we're going to talk more specifically about how do we think about power and influence given these global constraints and given some of the changing landscape. In particular, we just talked mostly about new production with shale, but the real story has to do with LNG and how that's fundamentally changing the way that gas is delivered and the types of relationships that are being built up around this infrastructure in Europe. And that I'll let you then turn to the readings that I gave you and pay particular attention to the readings on sanctions, okay? Because what I want to do is I'll give you an alternative way of thinking about it, and you can buy it or not, but then I'm going to let you sit in the White House as Congress has just tried to hem you in with a 98-2 vote about ratcheting up sanctions. The question is, are you going to ratchet it up on the oil and the energy sector? And given what we've talked about today, given what we've talked about the trends in Russia's energy diplomacy, as well as the trends in these macro level issues, and then a way of thinking about power and influence in energy networks, I want you to ask yourself, should we sanction? Should we not sanction? How should we sanction? What should be should we tailor the sanctions? Should gas be a focal point for sanctions? What are the costs? How do we assess costs? How do we assess effectiveness? So I'm going to turn it over to you for the last part of that to make sense out of this stuff, okay? But I don't want to take any more of your time because you have a very good speaker following me. So let's call it a day and then see you tomorrow.
Thank you.